Hi, everyone, and welcome to Setting the Board Agenda. I'm here with Dr. Dambisa Moyo to talk about everything geopolitical risk. Dambisa sits on the board of Chevron, as well as Condé Nast, as well as many other organizations. Dambisa, thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And I'm excited to hear, why don't you tell everybody a little bit more about your background? And I'm excited to hear what's on the board agenda.
Yes, thank you so much for hosting me. I'm delighted to participate. I've now spent the last 15 years serving on the boards of large, global and complex organizations. I'm actually quite a non-conventional board member in the sense that I wasn't a CFO or CEO. I wasn't in the operating side. I basically completed a PhD in economics, spent 10 years working at Goldman Sachs, and I've written a number of books on the macroeconomy and geopolitics. And I think that was really the allure of a lot of the corporate boards that I've served on in the last several years in mining businesses, energy, banking, media, and having that varied portfolio, really, the sort of continuity of those different companies is around risk and geopolitics and macroeconomy. And so I've been very, fortuitously been able to be on these boards, largely been in the audit and risk committees, but have served in nominations and also on the compensation committees too.
And what was the first board you joined?
So the first board of the large business was SAB Miller, the beer company, which within months, the chairman asked me to also become the chairman of the risk committee. So I was not only a board member, I also chaired the risk committee. We sold that company for $100 billion, just over $100 billion in 2016. It was the largest transaction of that year. And actually, in retrospect, so many things were happening around that time, Brexit, as well as just the broader rise of Trump, et cetera, that really impacted on the macroeconomic environment and geopolitics. I kind of often joke that the management team had assured us that there was no way that we were going to get taken over. We were the number 2 in the sector. Number 1 was Anheuser-Busch. No way we were going to get taken over. And in fact, if they were going to take us over, they'd have to take out the biggest bond issue ever to purchase us. And guess what they did? They took out the biggest bond ever and they bought us in that, as I said, the largest transaction of 2016 for just over $100 billion.
Wow, an impressive first board role.
Yes, no, it was, let's just say I was thrown in the deep end.
That's fantastic. And so not any organization in particular, but what's at the top of the board agenda this year?
So I think that I wrote a book called How Boards Work, and really the sort of more embedded mandate of the board has 3 parts. One is around overseeing strategy. The second one is around selection of the CEO. And then the third one, which I think has become very sort of au fait in the last 15 years or so, is around ESG. So it's really about cultural aspects. And so it's interesting because putting that mandate aside, it's certainly the case that the uncertainty in geopolitics, in the macroeconomy, in the broader operating environment has become top of the list. And I think as a microcosm of that, being on the board, the questions that we are dealing with now are more about does our horizon shrink as board members? We used to think about 3, 5, 10 years ahead. What kind of investments should we be making for that period? But now it's more about how are we going to survive this year? How should we be thinking about the debt markets? Or is there going to be another pandemic? What do you think about geopolitics? And so it's shortened the horizon.
And when did that change?
I think in many ways, oddly enough, it was the pandemic. Yeah, because if you look back over the last several decades, or certainly 2007, 2008 was a break point in globalization. I think people view that as peak globalization in trade and capital flows, immigration, and multilateralism. And if that's the case, we've really been in an environment that's faced increasingly more uncertainty. And if you think about it that way, the pandemic was quite catalytic in really changing things. I mean, we all kind of knew about the debt problem in the US. We all knew that China and the US were sort of at a tug of war. And we kind of all knew that the economy was slowing down. But it really was quite catalytic, and inflationary problems, the wars that we're facing right now.
Almost like I feel like it's each year everybody's been dealing with that new risk.
Yes, exactly. And I think from our perspective as board members, the point is not to ignore those risks, particularly when they're exogenous risks. It's really to focus on operating the business through thick and thin, and making sure that we are at least mitigating those risks, but thinking about our primary job, which is really to continue to invest into the future.
And so what's the board's role then in offering oversight of the risk of the organization?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to make sure that we're not surprised, if that's such a thing as possible. And if we are surprised by either the direction or the magnitude of a shock, that we are able to weather that storm. I'm often struck by how many companies have not made it to being here today. And we all know the lists, but I reflect as somebody who grew up in finance and having spent 10 years at Goldman Sachs, I reflect often on the demise of Credit Suisse. It just seemed to happen so quickly. And we barely even talk about it anymore. But that's one example. We all know the history of the Kodaks of this world.
Silicon Valley Bank, you can go
exactly.
through. Yeah.
And so very often these are organizations that have been around for centuries, in some cases centuries.
Yeah.
Lehman Brothers, and it's a good reminder that no one is safe really. And so risk mitigation, sure, staying behind corners, thinking about what kind of risks there are, exogenous versus endogenous risks into the organization. But more importantly, as I said, making sure that we're not incapacitated because we've identified risks, but we're using those risks to think about how to calibrate for investment into the future.
Makes sense. And if I think about one of our newer risks, or a risk that's probably ever present for many of us, is geopolitical risk. We operate in a world where there's probably more geopolitical risk now than at least any time in the recent memory. And we're also operating in a world where we expect to see multiple elections on the horizon. So how do you think about that? How do organizations weather that, this ever-present risk?
Yeah, I think there's a risk that I might sound a little bit naive in this regard because, there's no doubt about it. Political risk, this is the home of the regulators, matters. It matters, in a very grand way. But I think on a day-to-day basis and in executing my role as a board member, I like to try and encourage people to sort of see through that because, the Wednesday after the US election, we're still going to have to show up and run businesses with hundreds of thousands of people in different jurisdictions. And so not getting caught up with sort of almost, there's a risk of navel gazing. Oh gosh, we're in this election cycle, I think is a really important piece of counsel. Maybe just to push the idea a little bit further, the U.S. in particular is in quite a unique place because they do have a very strong bench of corporations, of investors. Many investors like Elon or Bill Gates are investing in what's traditionally been thought of as public goods, so things like the energy transition, they're in the social space. And I think they'll pick up whatever sort of falls by the wayside in the scrum for the American presidency, and the volatility of the political environment in that case it shouldn't be as impactful as perhaps in other places where the government is really the centerpiece of everything.
And so how do you find organizations best manage that? The trade-off between, the ever-present risk now, but to your earlier point, making decisions on strategy for the long term.
Yeah, so if we just take one specific example, I like to force people to think about the balance sheet. What's on the balance sheet? Do we have cash? Can we weather a storm? And I'm delighted to say that the organizations that I'm involved with did very well during the pandemic. That came out of left field. We didn't know where our employees were. Were they safe? How are they operating? The technological aspects that linked us together, but we wanted to preserve the culture. I think all of those things matter. Right now, and there's a statistic that just came out that there's an increase in debt issuance has gone up, or by different corporations. I think it's gone up 2/3, about 66% on a year-on-year basis, because a lot of corporations are worried about what happens in the second half of the year. So that's a lot of tactics, thinking about, should we be issuing debt now? Because it could get more expensive in the back half of the year. I think those are the kind of things that people think about in the sort of tactics bucket. And obviously having enough capital, as I said, in the balance sheet, but also thinking about the safety and operations, making sure operations can function, all that sort of in the tactics bucket. And we have a role in that, and we do oversee that through our committee work in particular. But then there's also more strategic work, which is, I would say, tends to be longer term. Where do we invest? What regions are we interested in? Where do you allocate that $1, marginal dollar of capital to generate the best returns? How does the geopolitical environment sort of inform or drive the decisions?
And do you feel like the increased number of risks that we've seen over the course of the last 4 or 5 years more challenging for the companies whose boards you sit on to be able to invest?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's absolutely the case. And there's a whole handful of reasons for that. We're in a slow growth environment. If you look at the IMF tracker on GDP, it's expected that growth will continue to slow down. I mean, there's a lot of people who think we're going into stagnation. What does that mean? It means that we're not, many countries, some of them we operate in, some countries that we might have liked to invest in are growing below the 3% per year in order to double per capita income. So really weak growth. High inflation. How do you think about pricing? How do you think about margins in an environment where inflation is, sticky at best? Some people would argue very, compellingly that we may never see 2%, range that the Fed or the floor that the Fed talks about. And what does the world look like when there's higher inflation? All the geopolitical risks that you're referring to mean that the world is becoming more siloed, and so it really does force the question, if you are a global business, so rule of thumb, you're based in New York or London, you're borrowing cheap money, investing in Brazil, Argentina, South Africa to generate a return and dividend up to home office. Well, if that world is fundamentally being fractured because countries are no longer part of the global system, well, that's a whole new model, a whole way of business of operating, your procurement changes, how you hire people changes.
Your supply chain, all that.
Supply chain, everything, really is up for grabs.
So in an environment of increasing risk, making it tougher to make some of those investment decisions, how have the most successful companies been able to still invest through that uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a rule of thumb, and this is obviously not 100%, but as a rule of thumb, I think we're going to see much more home bias. So I think there is going to be a lot of capital. And in fact, we've seen capital come back into the United States. I think a lot of the large American companies, for sure, are going to be more comfortable back in the US. It's a place that they can go kick the tires. It's not hard to get to your investment or your assets. And you understand the regime. You understand the political regime. You may not like the different aspects of it, the taxes or the regulation, but you understand it and you know how to negotiate, to lobby, and to actually be part of that.
At the very least, better than you would in a different country.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also, we all understand what the challenges are in these countries, but I think it's, dare I say it, it's much more acute. The challenge of slow growth, the challenge of geopolitics is much more acute in other countries. And so we board members, I think, regardless of where they are, have to figure out, is this really where you want to invest the $1? I'm sure you can get a return, but the amount of risk that you're taking, I mean, it's a kind of traditional Sharpe ratio, is far out, outstrips.
And so across your time in board service, has risk management changed over time, or is best practices then with your first board similar to best practices now?
Well, I think so. It's a great question because I think it has changed in a couple of material ways. So when I first joined, my second board, actually, when I joined the board of Barclays Bank, there was actually a risk committee, and it was always sold to me as the risk committee looks to the future, the audit committee looks to the back. So it does a lot of things like thinking about lessons learned. That would be in the audit committee. Your processes, your procedures, all of that would be in the audit committee. And then in the risk committee, you'd be looking ahead and saying, well, what kind of risks should we be thinking about? How do we mitigate for them? Mitigation doesn't mean no investment. How do you think about that? I think there are fewer companies have a segmented or a specific risk committee. I think the role and the work of risk mitigation is now a broader part of the broader remit of being on a board. And so that is in one material way.
Probably broader remit for management too.
Yes, I imagine so. Yes, exactly. And so I think that's a material way in which things have changed.
Interesting. So 2 rapid fire questions for you to close things out. First, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken?
Coming to live abroad, to leave home, I was born and raised in Africa. I know people think it's easy. Or they think
I wouldn't say it's easy.
Well, they also think, I think people also think maybe that we like it, that it's not hard to leave your parents or your siblings or your home, or your context or your culture. It's extremely hard. That's probably the hardest thing I've ever had to do.
I can't imagine, yeah. Separate, on the risk side, what is your advice to someone attending their first board meeting?
Keep your mouth shut. I think
you heard it here.
Yeah. Look, I often say, because people sometimes I always think, gosh, am I talking too much? And then I think to myself, they're paying us a lot of money to be there to offer our opinions, and we've got opinions. I'm not saying they're all equally weighted in terms of their value, but I think showing up and being engaged is really important. But I think on your first board meeting, a very good friend of mine described it as showing up in the middle of the movie. You want to figure out who's the protagonist, who's the villain. Like, you want to figure out what is the plot, what's going on here. And I think if you ask, ironically enough, if by asking too many questions, you might miss the subtleties of the things that are more on the cultural dynamics, the sort of social dynamics.
Read the room.
Correct, read the room. You'll miss that if you talk in the first meeting.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dambisa. That was super interesting, very fun conversation.
Thank you.
I appreciate the directness and the realness in the answers. So very fun. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did.